about managing your digital assets. So the assumption is we've scanned some photos, maybe just a few for at home perhaps, or more likely in some professional setting. It could be a library, it could be a business or a company, archives, what have you, where you've scanned dozens, hundreds, perhaps even thousands of photos, and you need to come up with some kind of standard to follow or convention in your file naming, but also what specs you're going to use in terms of resizing the images, that sort of thing. So it's everything that sort of happens after you've scanned your photographs. So why is file naming? Why talk about it? I mean, it seems kind of like something that's, you know, should be just obvious, and anyone can do it. Well, yeah, anyone can give file names, but there are a lot of special things you need to consider, especially as any of these projects we're going to talk about in terms of a digital library, images, audio, video. When you're talking about doing things at scale, that's where you run into problems. So that's why we're going to talk about file naming. So it goes without saying, it's crucial to any building of any kind of digital library, digital archive. It's especially important in the creation phase and for long-term management. So a lot of the things, it's sort of like raising children or cats or puppies or whatever, kittens or puppies. A lot of those things you do early on in the life of a born digital or digitized item is sort of going to set you up for success or potentially failure in the long term. So file naming and following good file naming rules are very important. So we might just think of it like file names. Well, the computer needs a file name in order to use that asset, but we might just think of it as labels or names for our files. So you want to develop a good file naming convention before you start a digitization project, or even if you're not digitizing, say you're in the process of just doing a lot of born digital, someone's shooting a lot of video, for example, or they're taking images of, again, anything from sort of the personal, like a wedding, where now weddings, it's not uncommon to shoot hundreds of photos because it's just so easy to do it. Anywhere from that to, say, some building, architectural project, a commencement, you name it, where there's lots of photos being shot, you need to think about what's your file naming convention going to be. So are quality file names needed? Well, I think we can answer that yes, we do need a good file naming scheme. Now, there are some caveats to that. If you use a repository software, we haven't really gotten to that yet. We will, but we haven't gotten there yet about your digital asset management system, your digital library software, digital archive, your website software, whatever we want to call it for now. When you upload, for example, images into that system, sometimes they will basically handle some of the file naming work for you, but there are benefits and costs to that because with these systems, again, some of them are kind of dummy proof, for the lack of a better word, where you could literally just upload any kind of file name to it and it'll take care of it and organize it for you. You could upload thousands of them, the system would still perform perfectly because, again, it sort of does all this work for you. It has ways to basically use a database. Typically it's a database that has a unique identifier handling system where it'll basically take each file and kind of take, say you've called it photo.jpg, which you should never do, but say you did that. It would basically take each one of those assets and create a unique identifier, and the computer will figure out how to handle them logically. So, having said that, why should we care about file names? Well, once you begin to digitize again or creating born digital items, you need to think about how are these going to persist over time. You're thinking about hundreds, thousands, maybe millions of files that you're going to have in your agency, your library, wherever you're working, and these need to last years, decades, or even longer. Especially as an archivist, we really think permanently or forever for the things we collect. So how are they going to persist over time? how are you going to easily manage them and update them? What happens, okay, we have this perfect digital asset management system as I talked about in the slide before. What happens if that repository, you move away from that software, or you lose funding, or for some reason you need to get those files back out? How will the files persist over time if you've taken them back out of that system and you no longer have that environment to manage them in? You want the files to remain consistent over time, over the long term, so how do you do that? And how do you use files so they don't conflict not only with other systems, software, but other files that have been created? Again, why should we consider file naming? Well, here is an example of something you should avoid. This even goes for record keeping. If you all are in the archives track and you do records management, they talk a lot about how you basically organize your records. Here's an example of what you should not do. And we've all been guilty of this. I will be the first to admit it, that I'm working on a project, for example, and I might give it project 2, final, project 3, this one, that one, blah, blah, blah. And then here, this person, this example, they've got it put in a folder called stuff. So really very useless file naming practices and folder path naming practices. But when you're working on it at the time, it all makes sense. You know what that stuff is and you know what the project is. But someone else gets a hold of this 10 years from now, or even a year from now, or even just yourself, you go back and you're like, geez, I don't even remember what stuff was, and don't remember the project either. So here's something to think about. We have a file system. We don't get too techy in this course in terms of like how the PC or your Apple or whatever, how they organize files. We do just enough though, so you can do some of the fundamentals of digital libraries. Here we have a more recent Windows Explorer. Basically, it's the file system. What it looks like, and Apple, they have what's called Finder. If you were to use a Linux system, it would have some flavor of either one of these. So every computer has some kind of file system, and they more or less behave the same way. Some of them do things a little bit differently. Some of them have default settings where they hide the file extension, some don't. Some present you with options to see icons, like little thumbnail pictures of the image. Some don't. So anyway, something to consider when we're okay. So file systems, we just looked at it too. You have a Windows file system. Basically, there's Windows and Unix flavored file systems. That's pretty much all that's you'll ever need to worry about. There are other ones out there, operating systems, but that's basically the two flavors, Apple being a Unix-based system. So when you're sorting, so for example, if I'm in here and I can click on, so here you can see it, I can click on name, date modified, type, size. There are even more fields, if you will, for your files, but I can click on those and they will actually sort the files that you have in the system. So when you think about, again, like say hundreds of images, thousands, millions, how are you going to actually find an image you need to find? And you may be pre-putting it into a digital library, so all you're dealing with are your digital assets on your computer. So how do you find them? So you're going to need to sort them. And when you sort them, let's go back up one, what are they going to sort on? Well, you might have them sort on the size. That's kind of handy. Sometimes if I'm looking to delete files that, like for example, off my computer and I have no more space and I need to get rid of a 50 gigabytes, I might just click on size, and all the big ones are small ones depending on if it's sizing from the smallest to largest or largest to smallest. You can pick those off pretty quickly, but that's not normally what I would do when I'm doing digital library work. Typically, I'm going to sort by name. So that's where we're going to spend a lot of our attention, is what file name. And you see, I'm not too nuts about these file names here. This is just an example, but how I'm going to typically want to sort on file name, or excuse me, on name. So that's where we're going to spend a lot of the time of coming up with a really good file name, so that way we can sort them in a logical and meaningful way. We have these other pieces of information that the file system will give us, date and date modified. Those are very tricky because sometimes you could be, for example, scanning a photo from 1920. That file, that 1920 date's not going to show up, and it's going to show up as the date that it was scanned. And then if it was modified, for example, you threw it in Photoshop or did something like that, that's going to be date modified. File type, you're going to find, is it a JPEG, TIFF, for example, size, and more. But these are all things that the computer considers important, not always things that you can use in your digital library work. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. But in this name, you have full control over what you name it. So that's why we're going to focus on that. Here's an example of some scanned newspapers. This is a project I've been working on. This is just a screenshot from my file system. But here we have a, so this is a newspaper taken from a labor union called CSEA. Civil Service Leader is the name of the newspaper. And we sent it out to a vendor to have it digitized. And we're going to talk a little bit more about vendors later in the class, but I wanted to show you, here we have what's called a directory or a path. And in that directory, just going to get out of this for a second. Just move that over so you can see that a little bit better. We're going to go back in. There we go. Directory or path. Computer programmers use path or directory a lot. Some folder structure, various terms for it. But anyways, that's what that is in Windows Explorer. You're going to have here, I have just an example of how I've sort of logically create a file naming scheme. I have a collection, so sort of the collection level, Civil Service Leader, the date of each issue. So each one of these is each one of these is a page from each magazine. So we have Civil Service Leader, the year, the month and day, and then we have pages. Each one of these is page 1, page 2, page 3. So this would be book scanning or newspaper scanning. We're not really doing, I mean, they're all images, but it's not really a photograph as we've been looking at. But so you can see how you take one image, one issue from a newspaper, and you might have 50 issues in a year. Each issue may have 16 pages or more. You can see how file naming can become very important, because it would just completely spiral out of control if you did not set up a file naming scheme at the get-go. Again, if I'm sorting through this, if I'm sorting through this project in this folder, the name is how I'm going to sort by. The date modified is basically meaningless. You can see that at the vendor, probably these are the times it got scanned. At 9 a.m. Now someone woke up, went to their scanning job, and just started scanning away. And you can kind of see the times here. They get a little mixed up for some reason, but anyways, that kind of gives you an idea. Again, the size and what the file name, all that stuff is pretty homogeneous information, stuff you're not going to really use in digital library work, other than to be like, oh yeah, they're all TIFFs, okay, that's information. This is really where a lot of your work is going to be done. And you can see I set up a little scheme there. We're going to keep talking about this, so let's move on here. So there's an art and science to file naming. There is no, I would say, perfect way to do it. There's many ways to do it, as there is in a lot of computer work that we do. As I've alluded to already, it's tempting to name your files image 1, image 2, image 3, or audio 1, audio 2, movie 1, movie 2, that kind of thing. That's something you don't want to do. Computer systems require that you have unique names within a folder, but not system-wide. So, for example, I could have image1.jpg, I could have it in a folder called stuff or project, whatever the folder name is. I could pull that image1 out of there and try to go and throw it in another folder. Say it's called commencement 2002, and if I have image1.jpg, I could overwrite that because the computer will allow you to have similar names. So you can have the exact same file names, but they cannot be in the same folder. And if you try to put them in a folder, it'll overwrite. And if you're not paying attention and it prompts you, do you really want to overwrite this? And you say yes, then you've just deleted a file and you didn't mean to necessarily. So something to be aware of. So a file name, and we're going to drill into this a little bit more, but it's a very easy way to provide useful and descriptive information as well as a unique identifier. So I can look at that file, just like up here it says Civil Service Leader. I know right off the bat, oh, that goes to our CSEA collection. It's a newspaper. Oh, there's a date. That's a typical way of dating things. I might not know what this is, but I can infer that probably it's page numbers because there's multiple for each civil service leader. There's going to be multiple images or scans because it's a newspaper.